Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Cactus Force. Similar to last year, I'm going to talk about data security, or in Salesforce world, it is known as sharing and visibility. So today, we're going to primarily focus on Experience Cloud, formerly known as Community Cloud. So last time, I started with some of the recent data breaches, and then I went on to highlight how Google bots can actually access your data if you're not careful. So I'm not going to scare you guys this time. So this time it will be more about giving a bigger perspective of the latest sharing capabilities and some of the things that you generally don't see in smaller scale implementation. Given that the presentation might be a bit too technical, I'll try to do my best to make it as understandable as possible, but please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Before moving on, I wanted to actually give a special thanks to all the organizers, all the sponsors who made this event successful. Let me introduce myself. I'm Tasin Zulkarnain. I'm working as a technical architect with Groundswell Cloud Solution. Groundswell Cloud Solution is a premier system integrator and a silver partner of Salesforce. As a part of working with Groundswell, I had the opportunity to work with massive communities. Each of them have millions of users, unique use case, and that actually resulted in coming up with a very complex sharing model. So I have provided my email address here, so please reach out to me if you have any questions. So here's the agenda for today's session. So I'm going to start with a very high-level recap of last year's session. So it will be a good refresher. Then I'm going to introduce few additional use cases, and we'll see how we can actually gather those use cases to share the data with the appropriate audience. Then I'm going to explore how the sharing model evolves when you have varying needs, and also what's the effect of account role optimization. So last year, Salesforce came up with a new feature in summer 20 release, which is the external account hierarchy. So I'm going to go a little bit deep on that particular feature, find out what might be the applicable use cases. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges when I faced when implementing these latest features in large-scale community implementation, having millions of users. So let's get started. So the purpose of today's session is to provide a case study, and then we're going to explore how we come up with an agile sharing solution in Salesforce. So as I mentioned, like based on the varying needs, the solution can change. So we're going to explore it. We're going to talk about the high-level problems, the new challenges faced, and some of the challenges that you actually don't face normally unless you're actually having a scale performance issue. So, and finally, I'm going to deep dive into some of the latest features, including account relationship, external account hierarchy, and also I'm going to talk about this account role optimization, formerly known as partner role optimization. So let's start the recap. So, so in the Experience Cloud, formerly known as Community Cloud, there's two different type of licenses, and which is very important to note. So the first one is role-based license, which is very similar to the internal users. They have a role associated with it. The other kind of user is very special. They don't have any role associated with them, and they cannot be associated with any roles. And that makes the scenario pretty interesting. They are made to scale. So you have millions of users for Experience Cloud. So this is the license to go. As they don't have roles, so there's some drawbacks. They have a very limited set of sharing options. So currently there's only two, the sharing set and record ownership, and that is applicable to few objects, not all objects. When you come to the role-based licenses, there's a whole set of sharing options. I have listed down a lot. Some of them I'm going to go through it today. And so that makes the life easier. You have a lot of sharing options. So for today, I picked up the case study that I presented last year is on direct selling model, and I particularly picked that because of the unique nature of it. So in a direct selling model, products are not directly sold to in the stores; they're directly sold to the customers, and that makes it pretty interesting. So unlike the traditional organization hierarchy. So in a direct selling model, anybody in any part of the tree, they can be able to see your data based on certain business rules. And that makes the sharing model pretty complex. So in terms of the data model, so this is one of the simple data model. We have account, contact, and user to hold the distributors, business, and personal data. And also we can have a set of custom objects we actually have the other parts of this distributor hierarchy. So over here, we are using the unit and unit relationship. So you can have a different custom objects based on your need. So in terms of the base security, we're keeping it as private, and then we're going to open up access using different sharing strategies. So let's look into our first use case. So suppose Crystal is a distributor. So she went to an event and met Nicole, and Nicole is interested to sign up right now. So Crystal has a need to see all of the information of Nicole. And as a part of the business model, she earns commission from what Nicole sells, And given that they can be at the lower part of the tree, and we need to scale, we are providing them community user license. So based on that, we have a very limited number of sharing options. The first one is sharing set, and that's what we are going to stick with it. So you can see the criteria about user's account equals to account that's sponsor, So Nicole's account record has Crystal as the sponsor. So when Crystal logs in, she'll be able to see all the people under her using that sponsor lookup. So this is done runtime, as this is very fast, and this is made to scale. But one of the core limitations is that there's one sharing set per object per profile. And this is pretty important to remember it because we're going to explore it multiple times throughout this session today. The other limitation is that there's no sharing record, so you'll not be able to audit it. So let's look into the next use case. The next use case is a multi-level downline. So Crystal has her boss, Amy, and Amy has a lot of people under her. So now Amy needs to see all the unit members under her. So as Amy is an important user, and there's not that much user who can be probably in that kind of rank. So we decided we can actually go with the partner community license, So as we were using the partner community license, there's a lot of sharing options that we can actually choose, So we looked into so many different options, We looked into enterprise territory management. We looked into individual record sharing. We looked into public group sharing, creating a public group and sharing the record for Amy and sharing the records with Amy. And then we looked into a bunch of other options, which are off-platform, doing it in Heroku and so on, and then hybrid approaches. And then eventually, we decided account relationship is the best option to go. So you can actually check out my last year's presentation where I actually went very in depth with all these features, and comparing the pros and cons. And probably if you want to know more, that will be a good presentation to look through. So when we choose this account relationship data sharing rule that came in Spring 19, it's a recent feature as well, but it is very powerful and it is meant to scale. So some of it actually covers up some of the limitations that you have from enterprise territory management, more than 10K records you can have. And then a lot of the sharing are done out of the box, so you don't have to create all the sharing records manually. You have options to edit because these are really the sharing records, but there's few limitations. So which I'm not going to go through it today, but I'm just going to give a very high level understanding how account relationship works at the back end. So the account relationship have two different parts. The first is the configuration, and then you have to load some records in a new object, which is account relationship. And that can be done using either data loader, or you can use Apex to create those records. So the first step that you need to do is that you have to enable an account relationship feature in the community settings. So when you do that, this new object that comes into the picture. It is very similar to other objects, other standard objects like account, and you'll be able to add fields there. So there's three important fields over there, which I'm going to explain in the next slide as well. So it's account to, account from, and type. So once you do that, like the next step is to create some data sharing rule. And these are sharing rule pretty similar to sharing rules, So this is one of the sample one that we used earlier. So what it says that when Amy logs in, give me all the account where I am the director using this director lookup, and then share all this record with me. How to share with me, I'm going to explain in the next slide. But just remember, it's actually pulling all of these records where Amy is the director and then sharing with Amy in some way. So here's the table. The first table, you can see that, as I mentioned, you can actually create those records either through data loading or programmatically. So for our case, like we just use programmatically. So this record, this first row is column is account from, account to. So once you create this record, in the backend, Salesforce actually create an account relationship group or Amy. And there's a lot of different groups in Salesforce. You have this public group, you have this role-based group, role and subordinates and everything. So similar to like this new system-defined group, which is account relationship. And once it does is that it does the next thing, what we mentioned in this data sharing rule. So it actually pulls out all these MN unit members. So in our case, it will be this 5 accounts and share it with that particular group. And the last thing it does is that it actually adds Amy as a group member of that group. So when Amy logs in, she'll be able to see all the records under her. One of the limitation here is that as this is a system-defined group, if you want to query the group member, you'll not be able to do that. So now we know how the sharing works for account relationship at the backend. So for our first use case, like the first level downline and multi-level downline, so we are using sharing set and account relationship to share the record. So now make it a little bit more interesting, So now, what if like there is other users associated with particular accounts? For example, assistant, it can be like other personas, it can be employees and so on. So how do we ensure that these other users associated with this account have the same access? In our case, suppose Kelly is assistant of Amy and she needs to see all the accounts that Amy has. So in order to do that, like we first have to revisit whether our current solution is gonna cover it or not, So based on that, the first one is first level downline. It is already covered because it's using the account field. And similarly, like for the multi-level downlines, it is using this account relationship and it is driven by the account itself. And both these account users are under the same account. So it is covered, So we're covered with the main case. The only thing that is not covered is that there can be a lot of other records which are shared manually to Amy. It can be unit or any other custom objects or any other account records based on some business rules. As those are manually shared with Amy's user, so Kelly cannot see it. So in order to cover that use case, what we can do is that we can either share the same record with Kelly's user. But in that case, like if you have 10 different users under this account, you have to do 10 different sharings, which makes the sharing table bigger and the sharing computation as well. The other way we can do it, we can actually use a role-based group. So what happens is that when Amy user is created, so as is a role-based user, Salesforce internally creates a role for this role-based user, and then it creates a role-based group. And I'm going to talk it in more details in the account role optimization, so stay tuned. But from now, what we can do is that as there's a role-based group, why don't we just share with that group, and then anybody who is under this account will be able to see that. So in that case, Kelly being in the same account, they'll be able to see whatever record Amy owns. So we are covered. So that's the reason we're recommending to share with this role-based group. Now let's make it more interesting. So we just spoke about this hierarchy related data, So now there can be other related objects, like there can be other different kind of data, financial data, like different action related data, and suppose monthly commissions, award, bonus, task list, rewards, and so on. So for getting to this use case, like I didn't actually bring up order details because those are already in Salesforce. So it can be some other object, custom object that you need to actually work with. So in our case, like we're taking, suppose, monthly commissions, there's a few things to consider before you actually come up with a sharing model itself. And before the sharing models, you have to decide on the data model as well. So the first thing is the currency if you're working with financial records, So you can be in one country and the other person might be in another country and you have your currencies, So Salesforce does provide out of the box the currency ISO code, so we can take advantage of it. So in this case, each record has a currency associated with it. So you can do it, but then you come to the next problem, So suppose like if you have millions of users and then if you want to put this historical data, like 2 years data and then multiple currencies, so it compiles exponentially. So you have to be very careful how much data you're putting into that custom object. So based on some discussion with the Salesforce product architects, we learned that they recommends 50 million for any custom object. So make sure like you actually adjust your data model based on this volume recommendation. The last thing is the access level for the historical records, So as we were talking about this hierarchy can change. Somebody joined as a distributor and at some point they decided, okay, so they had enough, so they want to get out. And in that case, like the people underneath has to be transferred to some other person, so the T changes. So the next question is that would you want to actually provide access to the old directors or old business leaders, or all this old data is going to move to the new business leader? In typical conditions, we actually want to keep it with the old business leader because like these are financial data. It can be some commissions and everything. There can be legal complications, So these are some of the considerations, And based on that, you can come up with data model. So there's a lot of options, but like I came up with the first two, which is important. So for this custom object, we can have a master data relationships with the account, So if you have access to the account, you automatically have access to monthly commissions, which is good. Everything is done out of the box, the sharing and everything. But the problem is that when you change that lookup or this master relationship, all this record changes and moves to the new business leader. So the old business leader, they actually lose access, and that's probably not all the cases you want, So in our case, like in this particular case study, we didn't want to have that. So in order to adapt to that, we needed a lookup. And with the lookup, it's good that you will be able to maintain those relationships and the access level. But the problem is that this out-of-the-box sharing, you'll not be able to do it. So we have to come up with new sharing solutions and need to check that whether the previous ones are working as expected or not. So let's see how much we are covered. So now, as we have this new custom object, monthly commissions, it has another persona to be shared with. Previously, if you had these master details, I myself or the distributor can see my records. Right now, I lose access. So there has to be some mechanism that the records are shared with me, given that I'm a community user. Not that much sharing options. And then we have the other two, first level and multi-level downlines. So look into how to get at this use case. As I mentioned, there's not that much options. The first one is the record ownership. Then you have the sharing set, and then we have the license upgrade. With the record ownership, so there's a lot of complications with it because like there can be some other user in the middle, integration user or some system MuleSoft who is actually pushing the data, and they're generally the data owner, or the record owners. So to change them to the distribution itself, we actually trigger sharing calculations. And if something happens, the whole sharing model breaks down. So that's the reason we don't recommend this particular option. The second option is the sharing set. The problem is that you can just have one sharing set per profile. So for the first level diamond, we are already using the sharing set. So if you want to use it here, then we have to adjust the sharing for the other use case, which is the first level downline. And the third option is the license upgrade. So not all the cases is feasible because like we can have millions of users, and because they're at the bottom of the tree. And to upgrade them is there's a lot of cost involved, and then we're providing them functionality which they are not really need, which they don't need. So that's the reason like we don't recommend the license upgrade. So in this case, it seems like to view my record, the monthly commissions, as a distributor, I need the sharing set. So let's use the sharing set. But now we come across to the second use case, which is now becoming problematic. So as we have used the sharing set, we can use it. We already said that we cannot use the record ownership. The only option remaining is license upgrade. And it might make a little bit of sense here because generally in a direct selling model, like there's not a lot of people who own Steam, or who has represented them. So based on some of the data I have seen, it's probably around 10, 15%, or below that. So in this case, like, so if you license it, we are not actually upgrading millions of users, just a small set of users, So in this case, it makes more sense. So let's upgrade the license, Now it's good, so they become role-based license when we have all the sharing options present, So I don't want to go through all the sharing options that we can actually avail. So in order to avail this, I just picked up two of them. The first one is the account relationship data sharing rule. And the second one is Apex sharing. So with account relationship sharing rule, this is a good option, but the problem is that, so suppose like this, around 500K team leads or something like that. So then you have to create those account relationship records. And then in the backend, Salesforce actually start computing this sharing. And it becomes pretty intense, and Salesforce does have some limits regarding unrecommended limits, how much sharing records you can create with account relationship. Based on some of the discussions I had with the product architect from Salesforce, so they actually turned 1 million records to be shared in a day. So as in a direct selling model, we're already reaching close, so I don't recommend this one. And then the other option is epic sharing, which makes more sense because, so this monthly commission, this comes once a time, and we have to just share it once with this first level upline, and then it stays. So it's a very small operation, and probably like it's just gonna take probably like in between 5 to 50 lines of code, and we're not completing the sharing model. So in this case, it makes more sense to use epic sharing. Now let's come into the last one, which is multi-level upline. And we are already using account relationship here. So for this multi-level uplines, we might be directors. We have already this account relationship records, so we don't need to create it. So the only thing that we need to create is one data share rule. So similar to the rule that we saw before, we can just, instead of the account, we can have this monthly commissions, and it will be taken care of. And probably the only thing to consider is that the sharing volume is going to increase, and that's where probably we have to be a little bit careful. So whenever the hierarchy changes, I would recommend actually do it in a different day, and then probably try to segment the data as well in terms of probably like share with the people from one country versus the other country, or the people who are most using the system versus the others which are using the less, to segment the data so that we are well within the limits. So see now how the sharing model changes, and that's what I meant with Agile 1. We initially started with the sharing model, where we use sharing set for one use case, but then for a wedding need, you have to switch it. And so there's a reason like we have the sharing set for myself right now with the distributor, and then we're using it like sharing. So the reason that I wanted to share, like you can come up with a sharing model at one time, but there can be some use case which might look simple, but it can drastically change the sharing model, and then it has implications on the different limits as well. So whenever you design a sharing model, make sure this is not set on stone, and it is you have measures to adapt with it. So now let's get into much more deeper. So we spoke about this account and rules before we actually shared the record with the distributors role-based group. So let's see what actually happens internally. So whenever, as I mentioned, any role-based user is created, Salesforce internally creates a partner role for them and assign with this user. And this is amazing, and based on this, like this, you can actually avail a lot of out of the box sharing, some of the sharing that I did, manually share. And then actually, if you go into the sharing rules, normal sharing rules for internal users, you have the option for roles and subordinates and so on. So there's a huge amount of sharing options that comes with it. But there's some drawbacks as well, So if you're working with very large scale community, so you're gonna soon hit some limit. One of the first limit is that there's a number of limit of how many roles you can create in org. So the general limit is 50K, which you can actually bump up with the request up to 500K. But imagine like you have millions of users and each having their own role. So there's a million roles that you need to create, and it will not be supported. To address this issue, like we can avail a feature which is not an easy path, so which is like the account rule optimization. So you have to get connected with the Salesforce support, the account executive, and create a use case to avail this particular feature. With this feature, you can actually scale to whatever amount of user, but it does come with some limitations as well. One of the core limitations is you lose this out of the box sharing capabilities. So you have to adapt to that. And then is that you have to revisit the sharing model as well, because it has a lot of effect, which I'm going to go through next slide. And there can be a lot of features which is not available if you're using this account rule optimization. So one of them is this external account hierarchy, which I'm going to cover probably the next few slides. So good, but you have to be you have to be careful what are the limitations. But it has another beautiful side of it, So if you're clever, so you can actually share a lot of records to the internal users, because I'm going to go through how it has been set up, and then we can actually talk about it. I'm not going to go through any details, but just remind, like if you're clever enough, you can actually share a lot of users that external users see with the internal users. So firstly, you have to enable this account rule optimization, and then what you do, you create a system user. And that system user has a role associated with it, and you put it on the top of this hierarchy, role hierarchy. Then for this distributor, instead of having this one-on-one roles, what they're going to do, they're going to actually, in their user role lookup, instead of having this one-on-one role, they're going to actually use the shared role of that system user. And see, it became scalable. So if you have 10K distributors sharing one shared role, to support a million users, you just have 100 roles. So you can actually scale. The other beauty of it is that, like, as it is shared with this internal user, you can set up the hierarchy in such a way that this internal users can see the external users on some capacity. If you want to segment the data and then use a different set of roles and everything, and then a different role hierarchy, you can actually use it. But as I mentioned, it has an effect on sharing model. So let's see, like, what are the use cases that is covered and what are the use cases that we need to cover. So for the first one, sharing set is already covered because like we're using this account with the sharing set, and then with first level downline is just shared with the teammate who does not have assistant another one. So it's already good. For the account relationship, it's already good. The only thing is segregating these related records, where we are actually sharing with this role-based group. So a lot of these distributors with assistant, their records are being shared with this role-based group, so it's not going to be supported. So what is going to happen if you don't change? As they're all sharing a shared role, anybody that has that role is going to see all this data. So this 10,000 distributor will be able to see those data, which is a major data rich, and you don't want to work that well. So we have to adjust the sharing model. So the easiest way to do it is that you actually segment these distributors. With these distributors, we have users, more users, like more than one user associated with their account, and the other ones like who does not have other users. So probably like the easiest way, as an example, distributors with assistant, distributors without assistant. So with the assistants, what we can do actually, we can use this distributors partner role, the one-on-one roles, and keep it like that. So these other users, including the assistants, that can actually see that data. Whereas for the people who does not have other users, suppose as distributors with the assistant, they can actually use the shared role. And in this case, as though they don't have any other users, we can actually share with the distributor users. But be mindful, you have to handle the different scenarios here. Like suppose at a certain point, like if a distributor has assistant, then they have to move up. If someone loses the assistant, they have to move down as well. So there's some scenarios that you have to handle. So let's now move into this new feature, which is external account hierarchy. So this is very similar to this role hierarchy. So just before going into depth, so this role hierarchy. So for the internal and the external users, and they're different. With the internal users, you can assign any number of roles, but with the external users, you have just 3 roles that you can assign. And so one of the limitation with the external users is these are kind of set on the stone. So if you want to do some customization, or if you want to give like record level access, you'll not be able to do. That's where this external account hierarchy comes. So it makes this role hierarchies much more customized, and it actually can dig down to the record level as well. So just for an example, so this is if this is a hierarchy, Crystal, Nicole, and Kim. So what we have to do, we have to set this hierarchy based on this particular table. So even before going to that, it's better to actually how to get this. So there's some similar to this account relationship. There's 2 parts to it. The first one is that you actually have to configure, and then you have to load some records. So you go to this community settings and enable external account hierarchy. And once you do it, you get a new object, which is external account hierarchy. And it has 2 important fields. One is like the account, and the other one is the parent external account hierarchy. So in this case, like you can actually have a record for Crystal without any parent, and then you have a record for Nicole where parent is the Crystal's account, external account hierarchy, and similar to the Kim. So Kim can see Nicole and Kim, and Nicole will be able to see Kim. So in real life, it looks like that. You go into the community setting, that is the checkbox, you check it, and then you create this record. So along with some of the fields that I mentioned, you have the option to make the hierarchy active, inactive, and then you can choose the hierarchy type. So right now there's partner and community. So it does come with a bunch of limitations. The first limitation is that in this role hierarchy, or like this account hierarchy, you can just have 5 levels. I'm going to go through it a little bit later, where it actually becomes problematic. Then there's a very limited number of external account hierarchies you can create in our org, which is 100K. And then if you use one account in one external hierarchy record, you'll not be able to use that record in somewhere else. See that we used Kim here as the account. We'll not be able to use Kim in other external account hierarchy. And there's few other considerations as well. So there's a lot of other limits and configurations. If you just look into the Salesforce documentation, I just picked the core ones that I felt is important. So the first one is that it does not support account role optimization. So that's a big problem. So when you're dealing with a large scale community, you'll not be able to work with this external account hierarchy. But I wanted to actually see that what are the applicable use cases, So the first one, that I can come up with is like, let's take the use cases that we use. The first level downline. If it is a small hierarchy, it's a small community, which does not have to look more than 5 levels. And then you have like less than 100K records and everything. So it's going to work there, But for our case, it didn't work for multiple reasons, like we're dealing with millions of records, so account role optimization is not applicable. So we are already out. And then the other ones is like 100K record is very low, And one of the other things that this is only applicable to account records, And this is very important to note, With the other role hierarchies, you can share any records, any object records, but with this one, it is just the account. So it does not really work for us. And then you can actually use it for multi-level downline, so which is pretty good, So given all these considerations, for our case, it didn't make sense of that particular limit, 100K and the ARO. And then, like there can be more than 5 levels, And in order to do so, like we can try to adapt so that like one account, we have 5, it goes up to 5 level. And then for the same account, we can set another one. But the problem is that you cannot do it based on that limitation. There can be just one active external hierarchy. So if it is a complex use case, probably you'll not be able to use it, but with simpler use cases, you'll be able to use it. So now let's go into some of the challenges that we faced when we did the large scale implementations. One of the first limitations was regarding account relationship. So as we used it, like we created those data sharing rule and we wanted to upload it, deploy it. But it seems that it's not supported by the SFTX source command, So if your deployment process relies on FFTF source command, then it's a problem. So in order to cater it, like we had to eventually use this API, and it's not a bigger deal, because there is not a huge amount of sharing rules you can create. Probably the max you can do is 100, but you'll not be able to do it. So, and these rules does not change that often. So I just highlighted because like just to be mindful of it, but in terms of like the deployments and everything, it's not a very big deal. The next one is the incomplete data or the license, and this is pretty important because with the account relationship, like there's a lot of things that Salesforce does at the back end. If some of the core lookups which drive the sharing is not properly filled up, Salesforce will not be able to share. And it takes hours actually literally for Salesforce to do this computation. Then if the data is not complete, you have to redo it, so it becomes very costly in terms of the computing resources and probably the time. So make sure you have a complete data set before you actually trigger this sharing. And the other piece is like is regarding the licenses. So if you don't have this role-based licenses, suppose you have community license, and if you're using account relationship, this is going to silently fail. And you have to find out by troubleshooting it, which is not a very easy process. It's particularly hectic when you are dealing with millions of records. So make sure everybody has proper role-based license before you start this account relationship. The final thing is that based on some of my learnings working with like different large-scale implementation, so there can be a lot of unanticipated use cases when you work with the data. So the first thing is that you have to validate the sharing model and look for any unanticipated use cases. Remember, like when I went through when I added few new use cases, the sharing model changes, So it might be it as well, So there's something that came up and you have to change the sharing model as well. So in our case, we probably came up. So like there's cases like unit history and a few other things, which I'm not going to describe today, but I actually spoke about it in my last Catalyst session. So you can actually see it. So you have to be very mindful of like any unanticipated use cases. So we went through a lot of content today, and I think you might be already overwhelmed. So I just wanted to recap what we did. We now know the different sharing options for Experience Cloud, role-based versus non-role-based, and how to get at them. And now we know how to actually start designing the solutions. So probably what I say is start with the sharing set and then go for account relationship, epic sharing, and then you can actually explore this external account hierarchy. And when you do so, like there's no solution that fits all. You have to you have to consider the limitations and find out which of them works the best for a particular use case. Then you have to be very agile in terms of adapting the sharing model for varying needs. We saw today that how the sharing model can change based on certain use cases. We learned about the new feature, external account hierarchy, some of the limitations where it can be used and where it cannot be used. And finally, I think I was being like we now know uh, a little bit deeper about regarding these rules and these account rule optimizations and some of the considerations that you need to put in when you're using some of the latest features like account relationship and so on. So these are all the things that I wanted to cover today. So I'm ready for questions.